The Pike County Murders. The chilling truth behind the crimes. True crime documentary. The small town of Pike County, Ohio, was quiet, too quiet. It had always been that way. Rolling hills, dense woods. The kind of place where everyone knew everyone. Families lived here for generations, their roots tangled deep in the land. But on the morning of April 22nd, 2016, everything changed. 8 people, all from the same family, were found dead, shot in their homes, execution style. A nightmare unfolding on the quiet streets. No one could explain it. The authorities couldn't wrap their heads around it. How could something like this happen here? In Pike County, of all places? The investigation started, but it didn't take long for strange things to happen. The sheriff's office was flooded with tips, but none that led anywhere. Days passed, then weeks, and still no leads. The community was on edge. The killer, or killers, were still out there. People started locking their doors. The tight-knit town was unraveling. On the 3rd night after the bodies were discovered, a new lead came in. A whisper. A rumor. Someone had seen a car in the area around the time of the murders. A red truck. That was the only detail. The tip didn't seem like much, but it was something. A detective named Mike Strickland was called in. He was experienced, had seen his fair share of horror. But this was different. Strickland stood outside one of the crime scenes. The house was quiet now. No one could ever have imagined the terror that had unfolded there. He looked at the thick trees surrounding the property. Something felt wrong, as if the forest itself were hiding secrets. The town wasn't just grieving. It was scared. Everyone was a suspect, and no one could be trusted. Detective Strickland couldn't shake the feeling. Something was off. There was more to this than anyone realized. He headed back to the station. The files were spread out on his desk. Photos, notes, a jumbled mess. But something caught his eye. A name he hadn't seen before. The name was linked to the family, but it didn't make sense. Not at first. He rubbed his eyes, trying to clear his thoughts. It was too late for new revelations. The town was tired, the case unsolved. But as Strickland stared at the name, something clicked. A pattern, a connection, one that sent chills down his spine. Suddenly, everything felt like it was closing in. The walls, the house, the town, the secrets. Were the people around him hiding the truth? Was the killer still one of them? Or was there something darker at play? Strickland felt the air grow heavy, thick with unease. The more he thought about it, the more the name haunted him. He had seen it before. But where? The answer was just out of reach, slipping through his fingers. He leaned in closer, his eyes tracing the familiar letters. The name. Part of the family, yes, but also tied to someone else. A connection to a former criminal. A figure from the past. Someone who had disappeared years ago. Could it be? The possibility flickered like a dim light in his mind. Was the killer tied to the family? Or had someone used them as pawns? Strickland felt his pulse quicken. It wasn't just a theory anymore. He had to dig deeper. But the deeper he went, the darker it became. The weight of the investigation was starting to press on him. He needed answers, and fast. He called in a few trusted officers. No one had seen what Strickland had seen. No one had made the connection he had. But they had to follow his lead. The family, the name, the shadows. They all seemed to pull him deeper, like a current in a river. The next day, Strickland made the call. It was time to visit the family's property again. There were more questions than answers. This time, he wasn't going alone. They would search every inch of the place. Every corner, every cupboard. There was something in the walls. Strickland could feel it. The air outside felt still, too still. The trees loomed overhead like silent witnesses. Strickland's boots crunched on the dirt path as they made their way to the back of the house. Then, a sound. A soft rustling. It came from the woods. He froze. Was it just an animal? Or was someone watching them? His hand hovered near his gun. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up. Another step. Then, a crack. A twig breaking beneath the heavy boot. Someone was out there. Strickland signaled for his team to move. They fanned out, closing in. The rustling stopped. Dead silence. Every nerve in Strickland's body screamed to move faster. to find the truth. But the truth was always just out of reach. Suddenly, a shout from one of the officers. He had found something. A small, hidden trapdoor. Under the porch. Strickland's heart skipped a beat. It was never just a simple murder. This was planned. This was bigger. The trapdoor was heavy. Rusty hinges screamed as they lifted it. Beneath, an old, narrow staircase led down into darkness. It wasn't just a basement. It was a secret. Strickland's flashlight flickered as he descended, his steps echoing in the cold, stale air. The walls were damp, the space cramped. Then, a flash of movement. Strickland spun around. Nothing. Just shadows. But his gut told him something was there. And when he turned the corner, he saw it. A collection of photographs. Photos of the family. But also strange images. Unsettling images. Mugshots. Dark figures. And at the center of it all, the name. The criminal. The one who had disappeared. The one who had left behind a legacy of violence. Suddenly, everything clicked. Strickland felt a wave of realization. The killer wasn't just one person. It was a web of secrets, of lies. And the truth was something no one could have ever predicted. Strickland's breath caught in his throat as he stared at the wall of photos. The name was everywhere, like a thread weaving through the lives of the victims. But there was more. A pattern. A connection he hadn't seen before. The criminal, now dead, presumed gone for good, had ties to every member of this family. A forgotten son. A hidden sibling. A past that no one had dared to speak of. The truth was worse than anyone could have imagined. Strickland's hands shook as he reached for one of the photographs. It was an old family picture, faded with time. But in the background, partially obscured by a shadow, there he was. The man they had thought was gone. The criminal who had evaded justice. But now, it seemed, had never truly left. The realization hit Strickland like a punch to the gut. This wasn't just about a brutal murder. This was a message.
A twisted cycle of revenge that had been set in motion long before the killings. It was all here, laid bare in front of him. But there was one thing Strickland couldn't understand. Why now? Why this family? He turned to his team, his voice low but urgent. We need to find everything about this man. Every last detail. I don't care what it takes. Get me his history, his connections, everything. They nodded, but Strickland's mind was racing. Something wasn't right. Something didn't add up. This wasn't just about old grudges. This was a deliberate move. The killer or killers knew exactly what they were doing. They had planned every detail with cold precision. Strickland felt the chill of their gaze on him as he stared into the dark room. The photos were telling a story, but it wasn't one anyone wanted to hear. He stepped back, his mind reeling. There had to be more. Some clue, some detail they had missed. And then, his eyes fell on something small, tucked behind a pile of old papers. A letter, tattered, stained with time. He picked it up, careful not to tear it. It was addressed to the family. But the handwriting, it was the same as the criminal's. Strickland's heart skipped. This wasn't a coincidence. This was a message. He unfolded it, the paper cracking beneath his fingers. The words were simple, chilling. Asterisk, you can't outrun your past. I'll finish what we started. Asterisk. Strickland felt a wave of nausea rise in his stomach. The criminal hadn't just returned. He had never left. The killings had been part of something much bigger. A dark revenge that had spanned years, decades. And now Strickland understood. This wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. A chilling thought crept into his mind. Was the killer still here, watching them from the shadows? Had they been followed down into this hidden lair? Or was someone else involved? Suddenly, Strickland heard a faint noise. A soft rustling from the staircase above. Someone was up there. And they were not alone. Strickland's pulse surged. He didn't have time to think. His instincts took over. He raced up the stairs, but when he reached the door, it was already open. The porch outside, empty. No sign of anyone. Yet he couldn't shake the feeling. The hunter was now the hunted, and the clock was ticking. Every step, every move, felt like it was drawing him closer to something that would shatter everything he knew. Who was left to trust? Who had been playing a game much darker than anyone had ever realized? Strickland stood frozen on the porch, the silence pressing in like a vice. He scanned the woods. The wind rustled through the trees, but it felt wrong. It wasn't just the quiet. It was the feeling of being watched. His eyes darted to the edge of the property, where the forest met the open field. Something moved. A shadow. Barely noticeable, but there. A figure, hunched, slipping between the trees. Without thinking, Strickland bolted towards the woods. His boots thudded against the dirt, heart hammering in his chest. The figure moved faster now, zigzagging through the thick underbrush. Strickland's breath was sharp, cutting through the cool air. He pushed himself harder, but no matter how fast he ran, the figure stayed ahead. He was closing the gap. Closer. Then, just as Strickland thought he was about to catch up, the figure vanished.
Gone.
Like smoke in the air. Strickland slowed, his chest heaving. His eyes swept the woods again, but there was nothing. No footprints, no trace. Just trees. Just shadows. It was as though the forest had swallowed the person whole. Strickland felt a knot tighten in his stomach. The game had changed. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. This was about something deeper, something darker. And the killer was toying with him. Frustration burned in Strickland's chest. He turned back toward the house. The trapdoor. The letter. The connection. His mind raced with possibilities. Could the criminal have planted someone inside the family? Someone who had waited years for this moment?
Who was playing him?
Who was pulling the strings? He went back inside, determined to find answers. But as he stepped through the door, a strange sound echoed from the other room. A low, raspy cough. He froze. A cold chill crawled up his spine. The hairs on the back of his neck prickled. Slowly, Strickland moved forward, his gun now gripped tight in his hand. Every step was deliberate, silent. The cough sounded again, closer this time. It was coming from upstairs. He crept up the stairs, each creak of the wooden steps making his heart race faster. At the top of the stairs, the house seemed unnervingly still. The door to the master bedroom was cracked open. Strickland's hand tightened on his gun. He pushed the door open slowly. Inside, the room was dim. The bed was untouched, but a chair was pushed back from the desk. A shadow stood in the corner. For a split second, Strickland thought it was just his mind playing tricks on him. But then, the figure moved. It was a person hunched over. Their back was turned to him, but the shape was unmistakable. It was a man. A figure that should have been dead. The criminal. Strickland's blood ran cold. This was it, the moment he had feared. The man turned slowly, and Strickland's heart stopped. The face was pale, gaunt, almost unrecognizable. But the eyes were the same. The same eyes that had haunted him for days, that had lingered in the photographs. The same eyes that had been a part of the family's dark past. The man smiled, a sickly, twisted grin. "You've been chasing shadows, detective," he rasped, his voice low and rough. Strickland's pulse raced. The figure took a step forward, and Strickland raised his gun. His finger hovered over the trigger. But something stopped him. The man's smile widened. And then, he said something that froze Strickland's blood in his veins. "They were never the victims, detective. They were just players." Strickland's mind reeled. What was this man saying? Who were the real victims? And what had he meant by players? Before Strickland could react, the man vanished into thin air. 1 second, he was there. The next, gone. Like the figure in the woods. Strickland's heart pounded in his chest. He was no longer just chasing a killer. He was caught in the web of something far worse. A truth that was still hiding in the darkness. And now, Strickland was the one being hunted. Strickland's breath came in ragged gasps as he stood frozen in the dark room, his gun still raised but pointing at nothing. The man, the ghost, was gone. For a long moment, Strickland didn't move. The air was thick with tension, as if the house itself was holding its breath. The silence felt suffocating, pressing in from all sides. Strickland's eyes darted around the room, but there was no sign of the figure. No trace of him at all. He lowered the gun, his hands trembling. Was he losing his mind? Had this been a hallucination brought on by the stress, the sleepless nights? But no, the message, the words were too real. Strickland had seen it in the man's eyes. He had felt the weight of that smile. It was all real. But the question gnawed at him. If the criminal wasn't dead, then where had he been all these years? Why return now? And why use the family as pawns in this twisted game? Strickland's mind raced. He knew one thing for certain. There was no more time to waste. He needed to get answers. And fast. With quick, purposeful steps, Strickland exited the room, heading for the stairs. But as he reached the bottom of the stairs, a sudden thought gripped him. The forest. He had to go back to the woods. There was something there. Something he had missed. Without another second's hesitation, Strickland grabbed his flashlight, checked the chamber of his gun, and headed outside. The night air was cold against his skin. The trees loomed like silent sentinels. The feeling of being watched was unbearable now, crawling under his skin. He stepped into the woods, the beam of his flashlight cutting through the darkness. Each step felt like it was taking him deeper into a trap. The sound of his boots crunching on the underbrush was the only noise, the only thing anchoring him to reality. And then he saw it. A flicker of movement, a shadow just beyond the reach of his light. Strickland froze. His hand instinctively tightened around the grip of his gun. He waited, barely breathing. The figure moved again. A flash of a code, a glimpse of something familiar. It wasn't the same shadow as before, but it was someone or something he had seen before. He swallowed hard and advanced, moving slowly, cautiously. His heart was pounding so loudly he thought the person might hear it. But as he moved forward, the figure came into full view. It was a woman. Young, no older than 25. Her eyes were wide with fear. Her clothes were torn, her hair matted with dirt. She looked like she had been running for days. Strickland's breath caught in his throat. "Who are you?" he demanded, his voice a low growl. The woman's eyes flickered toward him, but there was no recognition in her gaze. Only panic. "Please, please," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "They're coming, they're always watching." Strickland stepped closer, trying to calm her. "What happened? Who's after you?" Her gaze darted toward the trees, as if she could sense something lurking in the shadows. "They're here. They know you're here." Suddenly, she collapsed to her knees, gasping for breath. Strickland knelt beside her, his hand on her shoulder. "Who's coming?" She looked up at him with wild, frantic eyes. "They were never gone, Detective," she gasped. "The family, they're part of it too. Everyone is. They've all been playing you. You're just a piece in their game." Strickland's stomach twisted as her words hit him like a punch. The game. Everything, every death, had been part of this twisted game. And Strickland was the latest player. The woman's words faltered, and she gasped again, clutching her chest. Before Strickland could react, her body went limp, her eyes rolling back. She was gone. Strickland's heart raced. What had just happened? He looked around, his mind reeling. No one was there. The woods were silent again, too silent. His flashlight flickered. It was as if the entire world had gone still, holding its breath, waiting for something. Then, a loud snap from the underbrush. Strickland spun around. The flashlight beam landed on a figure standing a few feet away. He froze. It was the man. The one he had chased. The one who was supposed to be dead. Only this time, Strickland wasn't sure what he was seeing. Was it real? Was it another hallucination? But the man's eyes, they were the same. Cold. Unblinking. "Do you get it now, Detective?" the figure said, his voice like gravel. Strickland's blood turned to ice. "You've been following all the wrong clues." And just like that, the figure disappeared into the dark. Strickland stood frozen, the weight of his discovery settling over him. He wasn't just hunting a killer. He was a part of something far larger. And the game was far from over. Strickland's mind raced, but his body remained still. The figure had vanished again, like smoke in the wind. No trace. No sound. just the haunting echo of his words. You've been following all the wrong clues. Strickland felt his heart pounding in his chest, louder now. The air was thick with something. Anticipation? Fear? He shook his head, trying to push the panic back. There had to be answers. There had to be a way out. But the woods, these woods, felt like a labyrinth now, a prison designed to keep him trapped in its shadows. The trees seemed to close in, the darkness heavier. Strickland turned back toward the path leading to the house, but something stopped him. A glimmer in the distance. A flicker of light. At first, he thought it was just the reflection of his own flashlight, but no, it was moving. A soft, wavering light, like a lantern in the distance. Instinct kicked in. Without thinking, Strickland started moving towards it. Each step was deliberate, his breath shallow. The light grew brighter, the flicker more erratic. Then, as he got closer, the source of the light came into view. A small campfire. Its flames were barely more than embers, but they cast enough light to reveal the figures gathered around it. A group of people. Strickland's stomach dropped. His flashlight revealed their faces, distorted, tense, and unfamiliar. There were 4 of them. They didn't move as he approached. They were watching him, their eyes fixed on him with an unsettling calm. They had no weapons, no tools, just their empty stares. Strickland's pulse raced as his eyes darted between them.
Who were they?
What were they doing here? The nearest figure, a woman, her face pale and gaunt, shifted slightly. "You're late," she whispered, her voice thin and raspy. Strickland froze. How did she know who he was? He stepped back, his hand instinctively going to his gun, but before he could react, another figure, a man, older than the others, spoke. "You don't need that, detective." Strickland's eyes widened. How did they know he was a detective? The man smiled, a sickly grin that didn't reach his eyes. "We know what you're here for." Strickland's skin crawled. "You're all part of this," he said, more to himself than anyone else. The woman laughed softly. "Part of it? No, detective. We are it. We always have been." Strickland's mind snapped back to the photos in the house, the criminal's connection to the family, the webs of lies and deceit that seemed to stretch far beyond what he had ever imagined. It was all connected, but the truth was slipping further away, like trying to catch smoke in his hands. Before he could ask another question, a voice came from the back of the group. A figure stepped forward. A young man, barely in his 20s, his face scarred. His eyes were the same. The eyes Strickland had seen in the photographs. The eyes of the man he had chased in the woods. "You've been looking for the wrong answers, detective," the man said, his voice cold and distant. "Looking for answers in the past, in the family. But the truth is with us. We've always been the ones pulling the strings." Strickland's heart skipped a beat. This wasn't just a family of victims. It was a family of predators. The game?
It was their game.
Strickland realized with a sickening jolt that the family had been orchestrating everything, controlling the narrative, manipulating events from behind the scenes. They weren't just hiding their past. They were creating a new one. A new world, where they were untouchable, where they could make the rules. "And you, detective," the woman whispered, her eyes glowing with a chilling intensity. "You were the perfect player. You brought us all together, without even realizing it." Strickland's stomach twisted. He couldn't breathe. His hands were shaking, the weight of the revelation suffocating him. The entire town, the murders, the lies, the secrets, they had all been leading up to this moment. He had been a pawn in their twisted game from the start. "You wanted to uncover the truth," the man continued, his voice slow, deliberate. "But you've only uncovered our power." Strickland's eyes widened in horror as the full extent of what he was facing hit him. The family's reach wasn't just local, it was vast. They were connected to forces far more powerful than he could ever have imagined. And now they had him. Strickland wasn't just a detective in a small town anymore. He was part of a much darker web, one that reached into every corner of his life, every step he had taken. The truth was not what he had been seeking. It was a nightmare. Strickland's mind raced, but his body was frozen, trapped in the moment. The weight of their words settled like a shroud around him. They weren't just toying with him. They had been orchestrating everything. From the murders to the cryptic messages, from the shadowy figures to the whispers in the woods, it was all part of their plan. The woman's eyes bored into him, unblinking, as if she could see every fear, every doubt he'd ever had. "Don't you understand, detective?" she said, her voice low, almost soothing. "You've been chasing the wrong ghosts. We're not hiding. We've never hidden. We've been here, watching, waiting." Strickland felt the suffocating grip of helplessness tighten around him. The man with the scarred face stepped closer, his cold smile widening. "You think you're the hunter, but you're just another sacrifice in the game. A pawn." The words cut through Strickland like a knife, and he struggled to breathe. He had believed he was uncovering the truth, piece by piece. But now, in the face of their cold reality, he realized he had been a part of something much bigger, something ancient, something far darker than he could have ever imagined. "You're not going to get away with this," Strickland found himself saying, though the words felt empty, powerless. The scarred man laughed softly, the sound hollow, cruel. "We already have, detective. You can't outrun us. You can't stop us. We've already won." The fire crackled behind them, its light casting eerie shadows across their faces. Strickland's heart pounded in his chest, the room closing in on him. This was no longer just about solving a murder. It was about survival. And he was realizing with a sickening certainty that he might not make it out alive. The woman reached out, her fingers brushing against Strickland's arm. "Stay with us, detective," she whispered, her touch cold, like ice. "Let us show you the truth. The world we've built." Strickland recoiled instinctively, his instincts screaming at him to run, to fight. But he couldn't move. His limbs were heavy, weighed down by a sense of dread, as though his body was already resigned to his fate. He looked into her eyes, but there was nothing human there, only the hollow, predatory gaze of someone who had seen too much, done too much. "Let me go," Strickland spat, his voice hoarse. "You don't control me." The man with the scars smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Don't you see? You've always been part of the game, whether you want it or not. You're just like everyone else here." Strickland's mind spun. The walls around him felt like they were closing in. His breath came quicker, more shallow. "Who are you people?" Strickland's voice cracked, desperation creeping in. The woman stepped back, her face morphing into something almost pitying. "We're the ones who make the rules. We're the ones who decide who lives and who dies. The ones who get to choose." Strickland's pulse thundered in his ears. Suddenly, everything clicked. The family's history, tangled, broken. The years of darkness, violence. The endless bloodline of corruption. And then, the terrifying truth. The killer had never been a single man. It was them. It was the entire family. They were the poison, spreading throughout the town. They had infiltrated every layer of the investigation. And Strickland, the one man who might have stopped them, was now just another player in their game. He took a step back, his hand gripping the gun at his side. There was no escape. No one he could trust. The weight of that truth crushed him like a stone. "You've lost, detective," the woman said, her voice soft. "Now, let's see what you're really made of." In that instant, Strickland realized what they meant. They weren't just after him to kill him. They wanted him to break. They wanted him to become one of them, part of the game, part of their world. And that was worse than death. But he couldn't give in. Not yet. He raised his gun, his finger hovering over the trigger. The woman's smile only deepened, as if she were waiting for something. "Go ahead," she whispered, almost lovingly. "You can't escape." Strickland's finger tightened on the trigger. He didn't know if he was shooting to save himself, or to break free from the nightmare they had created. But as the barrel of the gun steadied in his hand, he heard something behind him, a soft rustle in the woods. And then, a loud crash. A figure emerged from the darkness, moving faster than Strickland could process. He whirled around, the gun still in his hand. It was another man, disheveled, wild-eyed. For a split second, Strickland didn't know who this was, friend or foe. But then, the man lunged forward, grabbing Strickland by the wrist. The gunshot rang out. Strickland's heart skipped a beat as he was shoved backward. The world seemed to spin. Then the man spoke, his voice low and urgent. "You have to leave. They're not who you think they are. They never were." Strickland's mind whirled. The shot had missed. But now, everything was shifting. The game had just taken a new turn. Strickland's head spun as he struggled to process the new voice, the new threat. The figure who had appeared out of nowhere was breathing heavily, his face a mask of urgency and fear. Strickland's heart hammered in his chest as he tried to steady himself. Who was this man? Why had he come? And more importantly, how had he known to find him here in the middle of the woods? The man's grip tightened on Strickland's wrist. "You need to get out now," he said again, his voice sharp with panic. Strickland glanced at the group around the campfire. The woman, the man with the scars, and the others were all watching him with cold, calculating eyes. They had not moved. They had not reacted to the sudden intrusion, as if they were waiting. Strickland shook his head, confused, as the man pulled him further into the shadows of the trees. "No, listen to me," the man urged, his grip finally loosening as Strickland stumbled backward. "They don't just kill. They control. You have no idea what you're up against." Strickland's pulse quickened, but the man's words made something click in his mind.
Control.
It wasn't just about murder. It was about power, manipulation, about pulling strings, even from the grave. The woman's chilling words echoed in Strickland's head. Asterisk, we make the rules. We decide who lives and who dies, asterisk. The man's eyes darted toward the campfire. They've been playing you from the start, detective. You're their perfect little puppet. Strickland's breath hitched. The idea felt almost absurd. But then he remembered the clues, the photographs, the twisted messages. Everything had led him here. Asterisk, everything star. A dark realization began to settle over him. The family, the criminal, the murders, it had all been part of a much bigger plan. A power play. Strickland stumbled back, his mind racing. What is this? Who are you? He finally managed to ask, his voice hoarse. The man didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked over his shoulder, his face filled with dread. "They're coming," he muttered. "They always come." The words were filled with so much fear that Strickland's stomach twisted. The man's eyes locked onto Strickland's. "They will stop at nothing. They'll use anyone. Even you." Strickland took a step back. His thoughts were spiraling, but before he could gather them, the man pressed something into his hand. A small, crumpled envelope. "Take it," the man insisted, his voice trembling. "You're not alone in this. If you want to live, if you want to end this nightmare, take it to the old house. The one in the woods. You'll find the answers there." The man's words made Strickland's heart drop. "The old house? Wait, what do you mean? Who are you?" Strickland demanded, but the man was already stepping back into the shadows, his figure melting into the darkness. Strickland's breath caught. He called out to him, but there was no reply. And then, before Strickland could act, a chilling voice echoed from behind him. "Are you really going to trust a ghost, detectives?" He turned, his hand instinctively reaching for his gun. The woman, the one with the pale, emotionless face, was now standing just a few feet away, a faint smile playing at the edges of her lips. She was no longer standing by the fire. She had moved closer, without making a sound. "You think you're clever, trying to run. But it's too late," she said softly, her voice almost too calm. Strickland's breath caught in his throat. His eyes darted to the envelope in his hand. She was watching him with a knowing, almost pitying gaze. "You're in deeper than you think," she continued, her voice colder than the night air. "You've crossed a line, detective. There's no going back now." Strickland's hand tightened around the envelope, his mind scrambling for any way out. The man had told him to go to the old house, to find answers. But what was waiting for him there? What would he discover? And could he even trust the stranger's words? The woman took a step closer, and Strickland's instinct screamed at him to move, to get away from her. But she didn't reach for him. She just stood there, her smile widening. "You should have stopped digging when you had the chance," she said softly. But now you've made it personal. Strickland's blood ran cold. Her words sank deep, each one like a nail being hammered into his chest. He felt trapped, cornered by his own choices, by the people around him, by the family he had once thought he could expose. The truth had become his enemy. And now, the only path forward seemed to lead deeper into the heart of the darkness. Strickland turned away from the woman, his mind racing. He had no choice but to go to the old house. If there were any answers to be found, it was there. And maybe, just maybe, it would offer him a way out. But as he started to walk, a voice, this time from behind him, stopped him cold. "Don't bother, detective," the man with the scars called out from the shadows. "You'll never leave this place alive." Strickland's body went rigid. The sound of the fire crackling, the wind whispering through the trees, everything felt unreal now. He was in too deep. And they were right. He wasn't just hunting a killer anymore. He was fighting for his life. Strickland's mind whirled as the words of the scarred man echoed in his ears. Asterisk, "You'll never leave this place alive." Asterisk. The weight of that statement pressed down on him like a vice. For the first time, Strickland questioned if he could really escape. He wasn't just a detective anymore. He was a pawn in a game he didn't fully understand, with rules he could no longer follow. The woman's cold laughter drifted in the wind, sending a shiver down his spine. He turned and started walking again, this time faster, more determined. The old house. He had no choice but to go there. Each step felt heavier than the last, the darkness closing in around him like a living thing. The trees loomed like silent giants, their shadows stretching across the ground. The sound of his boots crunching on the leaves was the only noise, but even that seemed swallowed by the oppressive silence. It felt like the woods were conspiring against him, pulling him deeper into their heart. The old house. The man who had warned him, had he been a friend or another player in this twisted game? Strickland's hand trembled as he clutched the crumpled envelope, but there was no time to question it now. He had to know what was hidden in that house, what the family had buried there. A strange feeling prickled at the back of his neck. He wasn't alone. He could feel eyes on him, watching, waiting. The air shifted. It was as though the trees themselves had grown more still, more aware. A crack of a branch snapping to his left. Strickland spun around, his flashlight darting through the blackness. Nothing. The silence was deafening. He pressed on, every nerve in his body on high alert. The trees parted ahead, and there it was. The old house. The house that had been abandoned for years, yet somehow still standing. Its dark silhouette loomed against the backdrop of the night, as though it had been waiting for him. Strickland felt his pulse race as he approached the front steps, the wood groaning under his weight. The house seemed to breathe with him, alive with an unseen presence. He stopped at the front door, his hand hovering over the handle. There was something wrong. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end. It's too easy, he thought. The door opened with a slow, creaking moan, as if welcoming him. The stench of decay hit him like a punch to the gut. The air inside was thick with dust, old wood, and something more. He stepped inside, his flashlight casting long shadows along the walls. It felt like the house was holding its breath, waiting for him to make the next move. Strickland's eyes flicked to the floor, where faint red stains marred the wood. He swallowed hard, the realization sinking in. This place had seen death. Asterisk more than once, asterisk. The faintest sound echoed through the house, a soft shuffle from upstairs. He froze. His heart skipped a beat. Was it them? The family? He gripped his gun tighter, ready to confront whatever waited for him. The stairs creaked under his weight as he ascended, each step heavier than the last. The air grew colder. The house seemed to shift, as though it were alive, asterisk aware asterisk of his presence. At the top of the stairs, he hesitated. A door at the end of the hall. It was ajar. Light spilled out from the crack in the doorway, flickering, unnatural. Strickland's chest tightened. He couldn't stop now. He had to know what was inside. His hand reached for the door, pushing it open slowly, the hinges groaning in protest. The room was small, barely more than a closet. The light came from a single bulb hanging from the ceiling, its dim glow casting long, ghostly shadows. And there, in the center of the room, was a table covered in old, yellowing papers, photographs, and the sight made Strickland's stomach lurch. A blood-stained letter, framed in glass. The words on it were barely legible, but Strickland could make out enough. Asterisk, we know who you are, detective. You will never escape us.
You are already ours.
Asterisk. Strickland's pulse pounded in his ears as he stared at the letter. It was the final confirmation. This was no longer about murder. It was about control. He was part of it, whether he liked it or not. The game had shifted again, and this time, it wasn't just his life at stake. It was his soul. As his eyes scanned the room, the flickering light seemed to grow even dimmer. The shadows on the walls twisted and stretched, as though they were moving, crawling toward him. A low, raspy voice whispered from the corner of the room. You're too late, detective. You always have been. Strickland spun around, his gun raised. But no one was there. The room was empty, except for the table. And the letter. A cold sweat ran down his back as he stepped forward, instinctively reaching for the letter. As his fingers brushed the glass, a sudden crash echoed from behind him. He spun around, his flashlight catching a figure, standing in the doorway. It was the woman from the campfire. But this time, her eyes weren't cold and emotionless. They were filled with rage. And she was holding something in her hand. Something sharp. Strickland's breath caught. He had walked into the heart of the trap. The woman stood in the doorway, her eyes burning with an intensity that made Strickland's skin crawl. In her hand, a long, curved knife gleamed in the dim light. Strickland's hand tightened around his gun, but his body felt rooted to the spot. Her smile twisted, half mocking, half something darker, more sinister. You think you can stop it? You think you can stop us? Her voice was soft, almost like a lullaby, but it cut through the room like a razor. Strickland didn't move. He couldn't. Every instinct screamed at him to run, to get out, but his legs were like stone. The woman stepped closer, the knife swaying gently in her hand. Don't you understand? She continued, her voice dripping with contempt. You're too late. It's already over. She raised the knife higher, its blade catching the faint light, as if it were ready to consume him whole. Strickland's breath came in short gasps. His mind was racing, frantic, but there was no escape. No, he whispered hoarsely, trying to keep his voice steady. This can't be happening. She tilted her head to one side, her eyes narrowing. Oh, but it is, she whispered, almost lovingly. It's been happening all along. You just didn't see it. The shadows in the room seemed to grow longer, stretching like dark fingers, inching closer to him. His hands shook, but he refused to let the gun drop. Focus, he told himself. You can still fight. His finger hovered over the trigger. He needed to act before she got any closer. But then, thud. The sound of footsteps behind him made his blood run cold. He spun around, his gun aimed, but there was nothing there. Just the creaking of the old floorboards. Strickland's eyes darted back to the woman. She was closer now. Too close. Her breath was shallow, like she could taste his fear. You really think that gun can save you? She taunted, her lips curling into a cruel smile. We've been here long before you ever stepped foot in these woods. Strickland's mind spun again, the pieces of the puzzle falling into place. The murders, the lies, the corruption, the family, and the house. The house was the heart of it all. The family had always been here. They weren't just killers, they were something else. They were hunters, not just of flesh but of souls. Strickland's pulse thundered in his ears as the woman closed in on him. The knife's edge gleamed, reflecting the little light in the room. His hand shook, the gun trembling, but it was all he had left. You don't understand, he said, his voice hoarse, cracking under the pressure. No one understands. The woman laughed softly, the sound echoing eerily through the room. Oh, we understand, detective. You're just too blind to see it. And in that moment, Strickland realized he had been wrong. He wasn't supposed to stop them. He was supposed to become one of them. The realization hit him like a freight train. They weren't just a family of murderers. They were a family of predators, bound by blood and ritual, an ancient force that had always existed in the shadows. Strickland had been following their path, but now he saw the truth. The envelope. The man in the woods. It wasn't a warning. It was a call. They had known he would be the one to uncover the truth. And now he had no choice. No way out. As if on cue, the house seemed to breathe with him. The walls pulsed. The shadows danced. The knife gleamed. Strickland's vision blurred, his thoughts scattering. He was surrounded. By them. By the house. By the darkness that had never left. He raised the gun one last time, but his arms were heavy. The woman stepped closer, her breath on his neck now. "Goodbye, detective," she whispered. The blade flashed. And everything went dark. Strickland's eyes snapped open. The world around him was cold, distant, and blurry, like emerging from a nightmare. The taste of blood lingered in his mouth. He was lying on the floor of the old house, his head throbbing, his body numb. The familiar weight of his gun was gone. For a moment, he didn't know if he had died. Had they won? But then he heard something, soft footsteps on the old wooden floor. A familiar sound. The woman's voice drifted through the fog of his thoughts. "Did you really think you could escape?" Strickland forced his eyes open, his vision clearing just enough to make out her silhouette standing above him. She was smiling, still cold, still cruel. He could barely move, his body stiff, as if the life had been drained from him. His throat was dry, his pulse sluggish. "Get up, detective," she said, almost mockingly. Strickland tried to push himself to his feet, but it was as if invisible hands were holding him down. He couldn't feel his legs. His head spun as he tried to focus, trying to make sense of the situation. What had happened? The woman reached down, her hand grasping his wrist, lifting him effortlessly. "Don't bother pretending," she whispered. "You've already made your choice." Strickland's chest tightened as the cold truth settled in. It wasn't just about survival. It never had been. The woman's words repeated in his mind. Asterisk, "We make the rules. We decide who lives and who dies." Asterisk. He wasn't supposed to stop them. He wasn't supposed to fight. He was supposed to join them. The realization crashed down like a wave, drowning him. His whole life had led to this moment. He had been chosen. And now there was no way out. "Why?" Strickland's voice was barely a whisper, weak, pleading. "Why me?" The woman's smile deepened, her eyes cold, calculating. "Because, detective," she leaned in closer, her breath icy on his ear. "You're just like the rest of us." The floor beneath Strickland seemed to sway, his knees buckling as the weight of her words hit him like a physical blow. His body, his mind, everything had betrayed him. He had been a part of the game all along. No matter how hard he fought, no matter how much he uncovered, he had always been one of them. Strickland's vision blurred again, but this time, he didn't fight it. He didn't care. Because in that moment he understood. The game had already been won. The cold air hung heavily around Strickland, suffocating him, as the woman's grip on his wrist tightened. She wasn't pulling him toward anything, but rather into something, into the truth, into the darkness he had spent his life chasing, now finally swallowing him whole. For the first time, he realized there would be no triumphant conclusion, no hero's redemption. He had crossed a line, and now there was no going back. The house, the woods, the people, everything had conspired to lead him here, to this moment. The woman's smile deepened, her eyes reflecting nothing but the hollow cruelty of the world she had helped create. She didn't need to speak anymore. Strickland understood. The fight had never been about solving the murders. It had been about control. About pulling him into their web, where he would be just another player in their eternal game of power and manipulation. The whispers, the signs, the strange clues, they had all been designed for him, a twisted invitation to join them. He had played his part, and now he was theirs. As the woman stood, her shadow stretching across the dimly lit room, Strickland felt the weight of inevitability settle over him. He wasn't just a victim of the Pike County murders anymore. He was part of the legacy. His soul had been claimed, just like all those before him. "You were never meant to stop it, detective," she whispered, her voice almost tender now. "You were meant to become it." Strickland felt a strange calm wash over him, a stillness in his mind as the house seemed to breathe, to welcome him. He glanced around, at the walls that had witnessed so much death, so much suffering. But now, in the final moments, there was only silence. No chase. No fight. Just acceptance. The woman took a step back, as though giving him space to see it all, to fully understand. And then, as if guided by an unseen force, Strickland stepped forward. Not as a detective. Not as a man trying to save himself. But as part of the family. The game was over. The rules were set. And in the end, Strickland had become just another ghost in their story.